Shabbat Shalom, L'Shana Tova. Because the Torah readings assigned for Shabbat and holy days are human and not divine selections, here at BHS, like many other Reform synagogues, we chose a number of years back to change the traditional Rosh Hashanah texts, that of Isaac's birth and his almost sacrifice, to the narrative of Abraham arguing with God, trying to avert, yet ultimately failing to prevent, the destruction of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. As an aside, over the last 3 decades of my rabbinate, I've come to realize that in spite of rabbinic apologetics, Abraham, our founding father, for all of his effort, fails at least as often as he succeeds at God's supposed tests of his character and leadership. And I suppose this year especially, I find that reassuring as a Jewish leader. Although we won't read quite so far into the narrative tomorrow morning, here is the essential conclusion of the story regarding the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, concerning which Abraham challenges and argues with God. We read, "As the sun rose upon the earth, the Eternal rained upon Sodom and Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the heavens. And God obliterated all those cities and all the plain and all the inhabitants of the cities and even what grew in the soil." So while it is hard to find uplift in the midst of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, things are slightly better off in the world around us than in the events described in tomorrow's scriptural reading. I know that is still a cold comfort, if comfort at all. But we members of the Jewish community take the long view, both forward and backward. Our sense of history and memory remind us that we have experienced uncounted catastrophes throughout the millennia, both as a distinct people and also as human beings participant with all of humanity. Enslavement and exile, deportations and expulsions, plagues and pandemics, pogroms and persecutions, extermination and genocide. Worldwide and here in America, over the course of the last few years, or even sometimes the last few months, we have seen natural disasters coupled with human inaction, hurricanes and tornadoes, earthquakes, catastrophic floods and wildfires, ever-climbing temperatures, rising sea levels and changing climate patterns, famine and drought, hunger and starvation, population displacements, a worldwide humanitarian refugee crisis on almost every continent. And then there are the human-made and directed crises, wars and invasions, bombings and targeted assassinations, increasing and violent anti-Semitism worldwide and here at home in the US, vicious and ongoing racism and xenophobia, discrimination and intolerance, persistent systemic injustice and inequity, growing authoritarianism and civil unrest here at home and elsewhere. And finally, as if we did not have enough already to grapple with, the novel coronavirus pandemic, which has seen 30 million cases of infection, almost 1 million deaths worldwide, and an as yet unknown future legacy of long-term debilitation and disability for millions. In our nation, that is translated into over 6.75 million cases of infection and just under 200,000 deaths. Here in New York State, over 33,000 individuals have died of COVID-19 this year. Most of those deaths have been in New York City at just under 24,000. Nationwide, tens of thousands of new cases are still being reported daily, and mortality rates remain above the epidemic threshold. Here in Brooklyn, we've been through hell. Even if many of us have been lucky enough to avoid infection and loss, We have felt the impact daily of fear and isolation. Even in our small, relatively sheltered synagogue community, a score or more of members contracted the virus, and we have had to bury a number of member relatives, mostly those who had been confined to nursing homes and assisted living facilities. And the virus is still out there, lurking, waiting, and unabated in its virulence. So, words of reassurance tonight feel not merely forced, but potentially risk ringing hollow. And yet, here we are, gathered, even if remotely and virtually, gathered to support one another, gathered to find our own support, gathered to acknowledge the traumas we have already endured and traveled through, and gathered to steel ourselves for what is yet to come. We are gathered, and our gathering has intention and purpose, familiarity and structure, meaning and value. We are not gathered here by accident or mere habit. For all the continuing predictions by experts and pundits on the increasing irrelevance of synagogues, the synagogue persists as the central, relevant, constant, affirming, and life-connecting institution of Jewish engagement. Perhaps that is because in a deeply fragmented and disconnected modern society, far more than anything, synagogues are still about community and human connection. If we take just a moment to look back over the last 6 months since the pandemic was declared, it's not just how well and quickly we at BHS pivoted, though we did. It is rather about how sincerely and effectively our attention and efforts focused upon the physical, spiritual, and emotional well-being of the individual human beings who make up our community. Our priorities and responses as a community have been geared first and foremost around people and relationships. In a society where too many have been left alone and isolated, struggling with impossible choices and a dearth of connection, our first and last and every other impulse has been to connect and listen and extend the helping hand to those connected to our community and beyond. We read in Pirkei Avot, Hillel omer b'makom she'ein anashim hishtadel lihiyot ish. In a circumstance where people have stopped recognizing their own humanity, have stopped recognizing the humanity of others, Hillel taught, strive to act as a human being. I believe that BHS, however imperfectly, has done just that. We have striven to recognize and embody and act upon our humanity and the humanity of our family, friends, and neighbors. We are certainly not the only house of worship or communal institution to have done so, but we have, and we have done well. But if we are to be honest at this season of Cheshbon Nefesh, at the season of auditing our individual and societal souls, then we also need to acknowledge that our larger American society, of which we are members and participants, has fallen short far more than it has succeeded in this same period. As a nation, we Americans seem to have developed a troubling reticence when it comes to recognizing the basic humanity of others, when it comes to caring about the most basic needs of our fellow citizens, a reluctance to endure even short-term personal inconvenience and cost in order to address the long-term needs and security of others in our society. And because of this, we now see natural disasters that have been exacerbated by human short-sightedness and weakness of will, a reluctance to plan, an immature and irresponsible preference for magical thinking and confirmation bias, for denial over prevention, for consumption and convenience over caution, and for quick fixes over lasting change. This pandemic is certainly no blessing, but it does offer us, it demands of us, we who are most privileged to be relatively safe and secure, a stark, unsought opportunity to examine the state of our larger society if we are willing to stop averting our gaze from some uncomfortable truths. Returning to my opening comments about our changing choices of scriptural texts on these high holy days, we might also note the tendency in the last few decades to move away from sacred texts which demand personal and national sacrifice toward passages more comfortably affirming our individualized and, should I say, argumentative natures, narratives that assert our right to contend with and even question our divine creator. Now, this viewpoint is, without doubt, a legitimate, significant, and ancient strand, long present in Jewish tradition over the millennia. But it is also worth noting that as we have chosen to silence and replace our scriptural stories of self-sacrifice and personal discomfort, we seem to have simultaneously, as a nation, moved away from publicly and communally tackling what is required for the common weal, res publica. I'm not claiming that we, gathered here tonight, are individually unaccustomed to discomfort and self-sacrifice. No, not whether for the sake of ourselves, for our immediate families, or even for members of our extended families, our neighbors, or even for our self-defined tribes, however we may define them. But in reflection, our changing scriptural choices seem to me to parallel a larger transformation that has been going on in our American society. A significant erosion in our national vision, our national willingness, our national commitment to personal inconvenience, personal discomfort, plain old sacrifice, on behalf of those we do not know, on behalf of those who seem different than us, but who are nevertheless part of the covenant of our greater society. A protracted but strikingly noticeable loss of an ethical, religious, and national ideal and value of what used to be referred to as the common good or common weal, from which we derive the word commonwealth, but built on the old Latin term res publica, which developed into our term republic. Once upon a time, we as a nation took pride in caring about and seeing to the well-being of others in our country who we did not even know. As we have become more and more narrowed and splintered in our vision and commitments, our willingness to exclude the other from our vision of the common good has grown. Our willingness, our dedication to inconvenience, to discomforting ourselves, to sacrifice on behalf of those we do not know. Well, that used to be hinted at in our national motto, E pluribus unum, out of many, one. On Yom Kippur morning, we will gather yet again, chanting and hearing from another uniquely Reform movement Torah selection with these words. You are gathered here today, all of you, in the presence of your God, your heads, your tribes, your elders, your overseers, every person, your little ones, your spouses, even the stranger who's in the midst of your camp, from the hewer of wood to the drawer of water, in order to enter into God's covenant, that God might raise you up today as God's people, and that Adonai will become your God. And it is not with you alone that I establish this covenant, but also with all those who are standing here with us this day, and also with those who are not here with us this day. See, I set before you today life and good, death and evil. I call as witnesses for you today heaven and earth. Life and death I set before you, the blessing and the curse. Choose life so that you may live, you and your descendants, that you may long dwell on the land which the Eternal assigned to your ancestors. These words, this covenant that we will read of, this is our choice today as a society and as a nation to choose to recognize and include not only those who we see next to us, not only those we perceive to be a part of our tribe, but also those who are nevertheless standing alongside us, and even those who, though out of our human sight, are part of the covenant, the ones that God sees, that are part of our covenant for the common good. Kain Yehi Ratzon. May it be God's will.
Please rise.